Okay, good afternoon. My name's John. I used to be an accountant. That sounds like the start of a therapy session. It probably correctly describes what I think accountancy's contribution has been to the lean movement up to now. But before we indulge in a bit of accountancy bashing, I'd like to make a couple of observations. There's a lot of improvement activity around, and maybe not enough of it hits the bottom line. Why? First of all, it's often local efforts, tackling isolated parts of the business to no overall effect. Poor understanding of demand and capacity, certainly not attempting to maximise the flow of value through the bottleneck resource, pacemaker, constraint, call it what you will. And as Dan mentioned, the local ERP system is unlikely to be able to do anything about it. Naive application of tools and techniques, so it's not unusual, at least in my day, for people to start lean with the 5S program. They would send a group of people out for some training, and from the people's point of view, it's perfectly natural to come back and want to do it somewhere. They want to show that they've absorbed what they've learned and they can put it into practice, but it'd be sheer dumb luck if it actually hit a sensitive area in the business. And finally, and probably worst, inappropriate delegation of leadership. And this was brought home to me, that's a few years ago now, visiting a company in the West Midlands. I'd been invited down by the managing director, and he greeted me by saying, John, as lean is all about people, I've handed this over to my HR director. If you wouldn't just mind speaking to her this afternoon, I've got a very important meeting to go to. And that was the last that I saw of him. And that was the last he saw of me. Because lean isn't something we do every now and then when we've got a bit of time left over. It's a completely different way to run the business from top to bottom, including how we look at the accounting data. Okay, so why can't we go along to our finance people? They're the natural people you'd expect to go to if you were trying to build a business case. And the problem for them is that they're stuck with a system that was invented circa 1915. I'm talking about financial accounting, which requires people in manufacturing at least to work out a product cost. It conflicts with lean activity, and here's just a few of them. First of all, the concept is that each time I make something, I add value to the company. So as we put finished goods, or as we put product into work in progress or finished goods, we inflate the value of it with a bit of labour and overhead. And as we do that, we have to credit something. As we increase the value of the asset, we have to credit something. And we credit the P&L account. So it's theoretically possible to make a lot of things all month, not sell anything, and still record a profit. Plainly, the saying should be, each time I sell something, I add value to the business. If we adopted that, that nonsense would go away. They don't recognise the importance of constraints, bottlenecks, or pacemaker processes. So we have the time of certain components take as they pass through the plant, and we use the time to allocate costs back onto them. But all time is treated the same. And plainly, time on a non-constraint is not as valuable as time on a constraining process. They encourage local efficiency and create islands of excellence. Well, islands. And always trying to speed everything up, because if we speed it up, it'll attract less allocated cost. They have little or nothing to say about lead time. So we can add up the cycle times of the components, and when we used to do that in turbochargers, I could say that the machined and assembly element added up to an hour, but that didn't really explain why it was taking 10 or 15 days to get through the plant. They promote the idea that the bigger the batch, the lower the unit cost. So I'm visiting a business in a couple of weeks' time that I've not visited before. And I'll get a shop floor tour, and I'll informally interview a variety of people, one of whom will be the material planner. And I'll ask that person, how do you work out a batch size? And they'll explain to me, well, I consult the moon and I have a look at the tide. All sorts of interesting things will come out. And then at some point, the person will say to me, and of course, there's the cost. Because they've got it into their head that the bigger the batch size, the lower the unit cost. And finally, they encourage cost reductions, which often prove to be mirages. Now, I don't like cost reductions. I'm a pragmatist, so we have to have them. But over the years, I have been appalled at how badly people have tried to put money to improvement activity. That's not to knock the activity, that's to knock the ability of ourselves to actually value it. And what we're talking here is the difference between common sense and common practice. So it's common practice to say that all waste removal is a cost saving, but plainly that's not common sense. And if you want to demonstrate it for yourselves, what I suggest is after this summit, when you get back to your respective homes, you move all the furniture into one room, so you hardly have to move at all. Whether you want to watch TV, eat, drink, sleep, all in the one room. Then try telling your partner that that's a cost saving. The look on their face will tell you all you need to know about the difference between common sense and common practice. Now, I'd have to admit, if you then rented one of the rooms out, you'd made a difference to your bottom line. But that's the point. We often have to move the cost saving, we have to move the waste removal into another couple of steps before we can actually make it impact the bottom line. I'm getting more inventive about these examples. As a managing director said to me, if only they would treat the company's money as though it was their own. And I was thinking, well, that's an interesting concept. Anyone here got a mortgage and pay interest on the mortgage for their house? A few heads? Yeah. Have you taken the mortgage payments and have you spread it over the rooms of the house? Is it very expensive to go in the back bedroom, but much cheaper in the living room? You laugh, but there will be someone back at your particular business actually doing that to try to work out the unit cost. My other favourite, well, it's getting a bit old now, but a couple of summers ago we had a new kitchen installed in our house. The old one was pretty awful, but I was quite shocked by how expensive the new one was to install. So I presume the cost of my meals has gone up now. And I should eat out more often, it's cheaper. So, perhaps we can have a different way, a common sense approach. We're in very good company. Apparently the man himself is very pragmatic, and as he called his system profit-making industrial engineering, there's a role for some good accountancy information in there. 3 financial measures which we won't be able to get away from in the foreseeable future are the net profit, return on investment, and the cash flow. And we'd like them all to go up, and we'd like them simultaneously. Although it is fair to say that if cash flow is your problem, the other two don't really matter. In fact, nothing else matters. I don't like the cost. It means all things to all people, and therefore I offer 3 different operational measurements. The first one is throughput, the rate that the system generates money through sales. The second is inventory, all the money the system purchases, buying the things it intends to sell. And the third is operating expense, all the money the company spends in order to turn the inventory into throughput. The order is significant. Whether you're making a big decision like investment in new plant and machinery, or a small decision like should I change over and make some parts, some different part numbers, I would always ask myself, what's the effect on the throughput first, then the effect on the inventory, and only third, what's the effect on the operating expense? These have proved reliable to me over a long period of time. The cost calculations are tedious and subject to a lot of opinion. You only generate throughput when you sell something. So throughput is not how much production made this month. Real money changes hands when you sell something. Real money changes hands when you buy inventory. And real money changes hands when we pay ourselves and others to turn the inventory into throughput. Now, it's easy to fool yourself about this. Looking at some of the attendees today, large manufacturers who have factories which sell to distribution warehouses, the factory can have a really good month, but until it's sold through the distribution side of the business, no new money has entered the system. And yet, we sub-optimize by pretending that it does. So we really do have to get to the end-to-end. The boundary walls are the only place that real money changes hands. And if you forget that, you can fool yourself into some local optima. So we want throughput, inventory, and operating expense to be driven down. And if we do, if throughput goes up, net profit, return on investment, and cash flow goes up. Operating expense down improves the same three. You don't have to work in manufacturing long to know that if you get the inventory down, the cash flow goes up. And this explains the hernia-inducing effort we often go to try and get the inventory right just for the nanoseconds it passes midnight on the 31st of December. And of course, as finance people tend to treat inventory as an asset, and it is, the right inventory in the right place at the right time is an asset. If we drive it down, we improve the return on investment. What's much less clearly understood is the very direct impact of inventory on net profit. So we're going to go through that quite quickly before we can get on to some of the more interesting aspects. So there's a role for reduced inventory in terms of product, in terms of operating expense and delivery. So let's take two situations. The first situation where we have high lead time manufacturing. So the product passes through several processes. We have an order for 1,000, and it's the company's custom. If the order is for 1,000, the transfer batch is 1,000. So 1,000 of whatever it makes pass through operation D. Each takes 0.5 of an hour, so it takes 500 hours. Then it moves on to operation B, which takes 0.1 of an hour, 100 hours, etc., etc. And it goes through the different stages until it reaches the end. And at the end, it's either going into finished goods, if it's a make-to-stock environment, or it's going to the sale of the customer. And by the way, making to stock is perfectly valid. If the customer won't tolerate the lead time, making to stock is the only method of handling it. When I came down this morning to breakfast, I had a glass of orange juice. I didn't rush out and plant a pip. And here we have the opposite. We have a company who's managed to get the transfer batch down to roughly 200. So the product moves on faster, the flow is better, and the lead time comes down. And we're going to contrast those two positions of high lead time and short lead time manufacturing, although the processes might be exactly the same. So we have a process which takes we have a lead time which is 4 weeks, and we find to our horror that we have a problem of quality, and it could well have started at the first operation. Now we've got 4 weeks worth of bad news. We have to go out there, we have to try and find the parts which are affected, ask for concessions, consider rework. It's chaos. If our lead time is shorter, the impact on quality is significantly less. And I have very rarely been involved in a serious lead time compression exercise which did not have a corresponding good knock-on effect to the quality. Also consider this: if you were a one-piece flow, you could stop the process before the entire batch was wrecked. And the chances of recreating the circumstances in which the quality went wrong 4 weeks after the event are non-existent. The shorter the lead time, the much more likely you are to build be able to build a proper countermeasure. Engineering change, particularly if you're in fast-moving consumer goods, if there is a 4-week lead time through the plant or the supply chain, you're faced with a dilemma if you get a better product and you want to get it quickly to the market. You might consider pushing the other product aside, and that means obsolete inventory, which could be significant, or you have to wait 4 weeks before it gets into the marketplace. And obviously, if you're on the high street, you could lose significant market share during that period. If your lead time's faster, if your lead time's shorter, you can get to market faster. Aerospace businesses are particularly vulnerable to this in engineering change management. If the plant has got a lead time of 4 weeks, but the customer's expectations is when I place an order, you should have it ready for me in 3, this business will pay premium money. As those dates come towards you and you realize they're going to be late, you either jeopardize future orders with the customer or you expedite. You put on overtime, you pay premium freight, etc., etc. If your lead time is shorter than the market's expectations, no premium money should be required. The investment impact. When you have lumpy flow, the last operation often comes under peak pressure at important times like month ends. And to cope with that peak, I see people laying down extra equipment, which often isn't used for significant amounts of the month or the week. Now that's real money, real investment, not being properly utilised. If your flow is better, if you can flow a little all the time, the load is much more even. I wish I had £1 for every time someone said to me, John, this lean would really be easy if only the customer didn't keep changing their minds. And then we measure the lead time and we find it's 4 weeks, which means that we're launching into production what the customer has indicated they want in the 5th week. So they've got 4 or 5 weeks to change their minds. So they ask for 1,000. A couple of weeks later, they say, could you make that 800? And the week after, they say, could I have 1,100? To everyone in production, it looks like no one knows what's going on, but the root cause is the long lead time. The shorter the lead time, the much more likely you are to be shipping what they want. And finally, I call it finished goods impact. To be honest, it would work at any level in the bill of material. If we've got a 4-week lead time through the plant, we will have to hold at least 4 weeks worth of finished goods because the finished goods has to survive demand consumption during the period we can't replenish it. If our lead time through the business is shorter, we shouldn't need to hold as much finished goods. So when I'm working in make-to-stock environments, that's one of the first ratios I look for. Now, these 6 competitive edge factors I learned when I was at college in the mid to late 70s under the heading of just in time. It took me a while longer to realise that when owners said all we're trying to do is compress the time from when we commit money to materials to when we collect the money, that these were the self-same reasons for doing it. So if I have another finance person say to me, inventory reduction is a one-off gain, I think I'll have to buy a gun. So what I'm saying to you is, in your own businesses, in manufacturers first, in your own businesses, you need to look for the business case for the compression of lead time to give you some of these knock-on effects. It will not apply equally any one of these 6 cases. You will not be able to, you're unlikely to be able to say all 6 apply to me. Certainly, most aerospace you'd like to think was not a make-to-stock environment. But some factories are. So cherry pick the ones that apply to you and dig. The problem is you do have to dig because unfortunately the financial accounting community does not really understand this. it perceives inventory reduction to be the one-off gain. And what are service applications? Well, they're similar. It's to do with queuing. This amuses me. And unfortunately, in this country anyway, there's going to be a lot of people who are made redundant over the next few weeks and months. Bad enough, probably feeling bad enough about themselves without thinking they're in an extra in a Saatchi and Saatchi advert. So, I'm obsessed with the inventory. And in service, you should be obsessed with the lead time. It's such a rich source of understanding what's going on in the company. Obviously, in manufacturing, we examine the part to tell us if the process is working properly. We should examine the inventory, the work in progress and the finished goods to understand how well or badly the company is deploying its capacity. So you can tell me that you've got SAP, Barn, JD Edwards, MFG Pro, all sorts of ERP systems, but if you examine the work in progress and the finished goods, only your capacity put that there. And if you examine the queue in service, it's a rich source of understanding what's going on. A variety of techniques we use to try to help us understand the potential for making money. I call this big picture financial mapping. It's taken from a forging application. So we have to understand that in any of these boxes, there's actually quite a lot more activity going on than just a one-off operation. To the map, adding the routes, we then have a look at the streams. Now, in reference to what Dan was saying before, I can see the making of a value stream here. I can see the making of a value stream here. This forge happens to be a 16,000-ton vine garden. There are only 3 in the world. And what frustrates me when I listen to lean accounting's explanations is that they say that they would describe this as a monument, and they don't mean it in a flattering sense. The monument, they say, we should buy another and dedicate it. Well, no. I'm sorry, there's a good economic reason why you wouldn't want to buy another vine garden. What we have to ensure is that the vine garden is not run for its own local efficiency. It's run to get good flow into the finishing lines. So, in big picture financial mapping, we add information about the sales, the due date performance, so the control cool route. The due date performance was 90% by week, and the heat treated route 72. We draw a timeline by calculating the inventory. So we can see that they buy materials and it sits there for about 28 days, and then they launch it through production. It takes about 35 days to get through, and then it sits as 11 days in finished goods stock. Now already that's begging a question to me. If you've got 11 days worth of finished goods, and your due date performance to the customer is as poor as that, that must mean that you're allowing things to get through that you can't sell, whilst things that you could have sold are stuck somewhere else in the flow. And then we have the operating expenses. Now these are strictly the operating expenses it takes to run these pieces of kit at the current level of activity. So 2.2 million in the forge because they use a lot of energy, 628,000 in the heat-treated route, and 366,000 in the control-cooled route. There is overhead, and it's significant at 3 million, but allocating it back to production doesn't lessen the expense. And as production can't actually influence how much is spent by the overhead, what's the point? It's not really a job for a grown-up, is it? Looking at the distinctive lead times in the different streams, add in the day's inventory, gives me a much clearer picture. So adding some very simple financial data to a map tells me that as the due date performance through this part is worse, as the lead time through this part is appalling, it's going to be much more productive to deploy our lean teams to work in that part than somewhere else. So you don't have to have particularly sophisticated accounting data. Add it to a big picture map, and it might just influence the priority with which you do improvement activity. Another very useful concept is the sensitivity analysis. Now, this is taken from a different business, and this is the money generated by the company, their material costs, I call the difference the throughput, and then this is what they spend their money on, and this is the profit that they make at the end. And I like to take quite a modest figure, like 5%, and say, what would a 5% change in any of those items on the left-hand side do for the bottom line if it worked in our favour? Well, if we managed to devise an extra service or a product that the customer was willing to pay an extra 5% for, then best part of $29 million would hit the bottom line. If we got our material costs down, it would add 11 million. If we took on another 5% business and we were able to get it through the business without adding any other operating expenses, it would add 17.8 million to the bottom line. I guess you get the idea. As you move down the page, less and less and less is added to the bottom line. I produced a slide like this originally to try to wean my management team off headcount reduction as a method of returning to profitability. By all means, take every opportunity you have not to incur certain costs. But if you start concentrating down here and missing the bigger picture, you're not doing your organisation any favours at all. Pareto exists, so use it. Another nice way of looking at the working capital is like this. So, in this example, again taken from an aerospace business, they buy raw materials and it sits there for about 24 days, then it's issued into production. It takes about 100 days to build an aircraft, and then they've got about 7 days worth of finished goods stock because it waits to get shipped for about a week. Then they collect their money and they do that 30 days later. The company pays their suppliers after 50 days, but obviously their clock starts ticking the moment they deliver the raw materials. So we end up financing 211 days. Now you can try and collect your money faster. Usually your customers are trying to slow it down, or they'll hold you to terms. You can try and pay your suppliers slower. Well, depending on leverage, they might put you on stop. In any case, that requires interaction with the outside world, which is always tricky. The WIP and the finished goods are entirely up to you. How big a queue do you need? In this instance, it was $211 million at the time. Now, they are the methods I would use to build a lean business case. I would get at the financial data, I would turn the inventory value into a time dimension, and then working with teams, we would speculate how we could compress the lead time, which of the 6 competitive edge factors would have a knock-on good effect, and we could bundle that up into an interesting business case. We don't use the business case all the time. So here we're going to have a look at how we calculate the flow cost. And it is based upon the observation that so little of the time is actually spent in conversion. So the lead time in this instance is 227 hours. the value added time is just under 5, so only 2% of the time is anything useful being added. Now, this is the method by which accountants work out the unit cost. They take a process like this, they break it up, and they say, okay, we've got a process that works at 80 hours a week, 80 per hour, 37 hours a week. That means we could have a total quantity of around 2,960. Maybe they'll degrade that by a certain demonstrated efficiency to a costed quantity. They work out the costs of running the process, they divide one into the other, and they get a cost recovery rate. They repeat that for all 4 processes, add it all up, and we've got a unit cost of £3.53. Substantially, that's what goes on when people work out a unit cost. Obviously, they're ignoring the fact that the mill is the pacemaker process in there, but they don't need to know about bottlenecks when we're working out a unit cost, so that's the way it's done. Let's add some other data to this. Let's say that we've got a snapshot of the work in progress. It's a batching system at the moment, and we've got 13 batches in process. Each batch size is 2,500. We've got cycle times across those processes, and therefore, very simply, if we multiply the queue up by the batch size and the cycle time, we get a total of 90 hours. So the lead time through this business, if we put another batch in, would be 90 hours, or 2.4 weeks on a 37-hour week. It means that we're only actually adding value 1% of the time, 99-point-something% of the time, nothing at all is happening. It's just queuing, waiting to get to the next operation. So, if it takes us £8,778 per week, as we recorded, to run the system, it takes 2.4 weeks for the product to pass through. Multiply it up, that means that it's exposed to the money it takes to run the system for £21,000, just over, 2.4 weeks. Divide by the amount sold, and we have a flow cost of £12.11. So the flow cost is worked out on the lead time, not on the cycle time. Why allocate costs at all is a valid question, but if we're going to do it, let's at least use the 99-point-something% of the time, not the 0.01% of the time. How would these typical lean interventions then, what would the impact be on these cost calculations? So introducing a pull system, applying 5S, including standard work in progress, or setup reduction. In the current cost accounting system, if we reduce the inventory, the profit would go down, because reducing unwanted inventories, the variances exit through the P&L account. They're called under recoveries. And we get this one-off cash increase. Doing the 5S and standardizing the work in progress, particularly at non-bottleneck resources, the profit would go down again, and we'd get a one-off cash increase. And reducing the batch size always increases the standard cost in a conventional organization. On the pulse system, if we say, okay, we only need to buffer the constraint, we don't need 13 batches, we can get the pulse system, with the pulse system working, we can get down to 7, we'd get cash, and the flow cost would come down by £5.59. If we introduced 5S, so we lost another batch because we've got standard work in progress now, the flow cost would come down by 0.94, and we'd generate cash. And if we did SMED and reduce the batch size, so each batch is no longer 2,500, it's 1,250, we'd get cash again, and the flow cost would come down by 2.79. and we'd get after those competitive edge factors. So the quality would be better. We'd be much more likely to be making what the customer wants. Things would be easier to manage. The whole focus of this system is keep the product or service flowing. A friend of mine said, you've invented inactivity-based costing. I thought, okay. Unit cost interventions speed up non-constraints, consumes cash and the flow cost would go up. Invest in non-constraints, i.e. double the output of a non-constraint, consumes cash and the flow cost would go up. Increase batch sizes with no corresponding increase in the throughput, consumes cash and the flow cost goes up. The purpose of this system it's an antidote, really. In an effort to handle complexity, people tend to break things up, and they appoint managers to head up departments or ranges of products. And the problem they do when they create that sort of an organisation is each manager, he or she, tries to optimise the bit that they can control. And so that problem that creates can be summed up by the fact that are the sum of the local optima the same as the optima of the whole? Most people can see that trying to optimise the sum of the parts is not the same as trying to optimise the whole. So flow costing looks at the end-to-end process and it drives lead time compression to be at the heart of things. If you have been, thank you for listening.